Are you unhappy with your drawings? Do you feel that after hours and hours, weeks, months, years of practice, of watching videos, of watching demos and drawing, things still don't look right somehow? And when this happens, it's easy to think that the problem is somehow with how we're putting our lines, our marks on the paper. We just don't have the skill to represent adequately what we've seen. Now, of course, this may be the problem, but in my experience, it's not likely to be. The real problem is far more insidious, far more tricky, and because of that, it's often left unrecognized and therefore unaddressed. And so our drawings stay pretty much the same because we're not understanding and therefore not tackling the area that we need to tackle in order for our drawings to improve. And the really tricky thing about this is that even when someone tells it to us, our first reaction is to think, oh, well, that might be true for some people, but it's not true for me because, well, I know how to observe. I know how to see things. And in many ways, we do. And this is the sneaky bit. We observe things from the moment of our birth. We're looking, we're taking in, we're assimilating, we're growing in understanding about how something looks means for how I interact with it, touch it, don't touch it, use it, enjoy it, whatever. And so it's hard to believe that there's anything wrong with our ability to see something. But what we haven't understood is that observation is not a one-size-fits-all practice. What we observe ends up being focused on what's important for what we're doing, for what we're using something for. And in general life, it's a fairly generalized level of observation which is adequate. In other words, simply growing up for most of us doesn't teach us to observe the things we need to observe in the way we need to be able to observe them in order to be able to draw them in some way accurately, effectively on paper. And as is the case with pretty much anything, learning to observe is a skill, but learning to observe what we need to observe to be able to draw well, that's a fundamentally different skill. And we simply don't realize this, and then we don't understand that we haven't learned that skill. We've assumed that we had it. And so it's been this very weak foundational point in all of our drawing. It's more fundamental than the ink on the paper, because this has to happen first. And the ink on the paper is totally dependent on my having observed what I've needed to observe before I tried to put the ink anywhere at all. I'd known about this, but I think possibly because I'd painted for a decade before I started drawing, I had developed a lot of the observational skills doing that, which were readily transferable to the drawing. But there were still times when I've looked at my reference and I've got the ink on the paper, I'm doing lines and marks and whatever, and I suddenly realized I'm not sure what angle exactly this is. I know it's sort of in this direction, but is it more up or more down? And I realized at that point I had a choice to look back at my reference and work out exactly what that angle is. Now that I know I need to observe that angle more closely, more carefully, because I don't currently have that information in my mind. And I was surprised at that moment of, will I look again or will I just draw the line that I think is likely to be right? I was surprised the strength of the pull to just draw the line that I think is probably going to be right. And so often, in fact, most of the time when I looked back, my intuition was wrong. It would have led me astray if I'd done that. But I honestly couldn't believe the effort it felt that it was going to be to have a second, and can I say, at times third and even fourth look at my reference before I put the pen on the paper. If you know my drawings and you think they're accurate, there's a price we pay to achieve that. And at times it really is work. And while it wouldn't sound like work to anyone who doesn't do drawing themselves, it's a surprisingly huge effort to have to look back when we've got the pen on the paper to show restraint while we check what we think we've seen. And this is the problem. So much of the time, we're drawing what we think we've seen. And the reason why we don't have to observe something so carefully is because we have a lot of more generalized memories of that thing that we've filed in our head. Now, we filed them in our head as part of living, as part of life. But what we again don't understand is we haven't had to file the type of filing that we need to draw. We've filed all these sort of generalized images that if we remember them, they're going to come across as somewhat generic because we're actually bundling a whole lot of memories together all at once in the one section. But it makes us think, well, I know what this looks like. And then we blame the poor old lines on the paper when our drawing doesn't look how it should. But the good news is that observation, because it is a skill, observation for drawing is certainly a skill, it can be learnt. And if this is new to you, just coming to understand that we need to work on our observation skills for when we're drawing is a huge step forward. I do have a playlist on observation for drawing that has, I think, about 4 or 5 videos on it. It's not a long playlist, but they deal with different aspects of how we need to observe if we're going to draw, shown in a range of different subjects. So if you've never considered whether it's actually your observation that's holding back your drawing, I really suggest you look at the playlist. I'll make it the end screen for this video and see if the content of those videos gives you more understanding of the process of observing for drawing and therefore more of a focus to work on when you observe. But quite frankly, the simplest and most obvious way to improve our observation for drawing is not to be expecting to draw as much without looking back at our reference as we almost certainly do. When I spend my time looking, I'm actually looking at less, but I'm looking at it more deeply and in different ways. But what that means, hopefully, is that when I turn to look at the paper now, I have everything in here that I need to now know where I want to position my pen, at what angle is the line, where it stops, how far it might be from something I've already drawn, and so forth. All the particular details that we need to find in our observation, which is then the foundation for everything we do with our pen on the paper. And whether you look at my videos on the topic or not, it's a topic that we certainly need to understand and to be aware of, and to make sure that that's not the unsuspected weak spot in our drawing that we never knew we had. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope these thoughts have been helpful. Over and over again with my students, I find that observation, lack of observation, thinking that we've seen what we need to see to draw well when we haven't, is the underlying problem. It's the foundational problem that affects everything else. And if it doesn't in itself cause other problems, it can make other problems look worse than they actually are as well. We need to stop drawing from what we think we know, from our vague memories all patched up together somehow, creating a generic object. We need to stop referring to that. Instead, focus on the very particular elements of what we're looking at and the conditions, the angles under which we're looking at it. And to only look at as many of these elements at once as we know we can possibly then draw accurately before we look back again. And if you have, even just for a moment, a place where part of you as you draw something goes, oh, how does this go? Stop. Stop there and have another look at the reference. And don't be tempted to think, oh, no, I've got this. It's going to be like this. This whole area of observing more carefully, more appropriately for drawing is probably the largest, fastest, easiest way we can improve our drawings. But hey, whatever you draw, however it's turning out, whatever your observations are like, whatever you decide to do, make sure you still have fun. I'll see you next video.